Hey everybody, welcome to the first Detections podcast. I am one of your hosts, Understudy 77. With me we have...
The Exile, the Tradies.
So this is a new thing. We just got into this. I'm going to let him go into the story because it's a long story, and I know he likes to tell it. My short version is much different, which I may share afterward. But this is our attempt to bring a little bit of Blue Team into the world of podcasting, trying to not repeat kind of any of the other stuff that's been going on in the world. Exile, do you want to go ahead and start with kind of the concept and how this all came about?
Yeah, absolutely. One, I'm excited that we're getting started. It was nice to meet you at DerbyCon and find a like-minded person who thought this idea was great. The idea itself started when I was trying to look for podcasts myself when I first got into cybersecurity, and I noticed that there was a pretty big lack of Blue Team-focused ones. There was a lot of focused on the cool new hack, the sexy stuff that comes with pen testing, but that didn't apply to me getting out of school, getting a job in a SOC, being an analyst, and that's obviously where I was trying to go, what I wanted to learn, because it was I was familiar with concepts, but I wanted to dig in more, and as I progressed through my career over the last 5 years, I noticed that there was a lot of people who were just as hungry at the beginning. So I had this idea, and here in the Portland, Oregon area, I floated it around. A lot of people liked the idea, but very few people had the time until I met Understudy here at DerbyCon, the finish line. And he said, sounds like a good idea. Let's do it. So here we are.
Hey, that was a much shorter version than the whole blog post. And so one interesting thing that kind of comes out of that is you talk about like, oh, everybody wants to talk about what's sexy. So we'll get into our histories a little bit in a minute, but for about the last 11 years I've been doing this, and I tell everybody whenever I talk to anybody that my mission is to make Blue Team sexier than Red Team, because in reality I think it is. And I think we can kind of talk about that as we go through and as you see some of the interest that we have and the things that we want to talk about long term. My short version is we met at DerbyCon. We hit it off, we got along, and we said, hey, let's do a podcast because I think I want a soapbox and he wants to provide good information.
Yeah, absolutely. The good information is the key thing, because there's a lot out there to sift through, and being able to have something that's focused on the Blue Team, letting us focus on the analysts, focus on incident responders, the people who are going into an office every day, doing a lot of the same stuff, looking for interesting things. We want to be able to help them progress as fast as their passion will allow them.
That's well said. And so from a format perspective, we're going to keep it pretty simple. We're going to talk a little bit about news. Things that we read, things that we thought were interesting. We're going to move into a topic. That topic can range pretty wildly. Tonight it's going to be commodity malware. We're going to be covering things like skills shortages. We're going to be covering things like SOC and responsibilities, things like incident response and consulting, and so on and so forth. And then we will kind of put together, hopefully from the topic, but not always, because sometimes it'll be conceptual. We'll put together a detection, something that you can take to your organization, at least at a conceptual level, and say, hey, am I looking for this? And that'll be about where we sit. Then every fourth or fifth show probably we'll be bringing in open source people or experts in a certain field to share their views, which will be a completely different format for the show. Disclaimer, all of this is subject to change based on our whims and flights of fancy. That's just kind of the way that it goes.
And I can be pretty flighty myself.
Me as well. You might find us talking about board games, you might find us talking about video games, whatever the case may be, but we will try our best to stay on general topic. But I'm sure at this point, we're a couple minutes in and everybody's probably asking, what makes you qualified to have this conversation? And the answer is nothing. But we can talk a little bit about ourselves beforehand. Exile, do you want to kick it off and tell everybody who, the 2 or 3 people that are going to listen to this what you do?
Yeah, and those 2 or 3 people will be people we know, and we'll make them do it, like our parents. And our mom will say, you have the perfect voice for podcasting.
Right? I don't have the face for it, that's for sure.
So I want to reiterate here that what we're looking at doing is a conversational format. So that's where like the flight of fancy will come in, because it's just going to be 2 people here talking. And what does qualify us? I don't know. What qualifies you to have a conversation with your friend sitting next to you in a coffee shop? You're sitting there talking. That's really all this is. We both both Understudy and I have a passion for enabling people and empowering the people that we work around or maybe are directly responsible for with making them better at doing their job. So we just speak from a passion. As far as my background goes, I've kind of been playing around with the whole information cybersecurity stuff on and off over a few years before I went back to school. I got interested in it when I recognized that I had a pretty good talent. The way my brain thought is I picked up information technology and computer stuff fairly quickly. And then I started playing with Backtrack. I may or may not have, not made into anything, done a few things in the wild with it at a very young age. That's been more than 10 years ago, so keep that in mind. FBI, when you're listening to this over the internet. But then I just went around trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and took a 10-year break from school. Before I went back, had enough work experience, figured out what I wanted to do, went back with a target focus and getting in information security, cybersecurity, just to get the degree to get past that HR gate, which unfortunately exists in many places. So I went that just to get that out of the way and ended up getting a job in a SOC in my last term in school. So I already had a job in the industry for the education that I was getting, and that was 5 years ago. Since then, I was promoted up to being a senior lead analyst, did some consulting, did some incident response, have done SOC maturing through like a CMMI model, did some tool engineering in various SIMs and IDS and things like that. Worked pretty heavily in Splunk for a while. Pardon me. And sorry, holding back a hiccup there. Worked pretty heavily in Splunk and have developed a full tabletop weekly exercise for the last contract that I did to help the analysts there go from nothing to being a functional and efficient SOC in like half the time I did from the first one that I helped stand up.
Ooh, we can do a whole thing on tabletop exercises. That'll be fun.
I love tabletop exercises. I've totally embraced the cubicles and compromises and backdoors and breaches from Black Hills because
I was just going to say we're going to go completely out and talk about backdoors and breaches because I got a copy of DerbyCon too.
Yes. First edition from DerbyCon. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Black Hills.
So what else? What else have you done? Anything else you want to share?
Oh, the last thing I was going to say is all of that stuff has been mainly in the power utility sector, dealing with everything from generation to transmission and then how that all interacts with the corporate environment. And currently, what the company I work for has tasked me to do is work with our tech manager to take our internal operations, not just for SOC, but eventually across the board, and have it go through the same maturity model, but also create better operational efficiency and develop a full-fledged training program for the SOC analysts.
Nice. So mine is actually not dissimilar. I went to school for information technology, dropped out. I took a lot less time off, though. I only took about 3 months. Went back, got a degree in information technology with a kind of specialization in computer security and digital forensics. From there, I went into a SOC role for an MSSP up in Pittsburgh. Moved from there into the government sector in the general DC area. Was a SIM engineer for a little while. Spent a really long time as an incident response consultant, probably the bulk of my career. But then the last several years, I've kind of pivoted into this position that I like to say concepts, not console. So I was a virtual CISO with the same company for a little while. I was the director of their threat assessment team. I was the director of another security operations team. And I was the manager/director of another managed security company. Before I landed where I landed, typically I'd be a little bit more careful about saying the wheres, but it's on my Twitter profile. So I am the head of the Security Operations Center at Verizon Media, which is Yahoo, AOL, Huffington Post, so on and so forth. So it's my job to help protect any of the customers as well as our users in a pretty massive and unique organization. That that spawns from building detections and use cases to actually doing some of the analysis work. But again, I have a team that does that largely more than I do day to day now. A lot of what I do is build that program, kind of get things set up and go from there, which is something that I just so enjoy building programs and building people. And that kind of lined up really nicely with doing something like this, which would kind of help us build there. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm pretty involved in the conference scene as well. I've talked at quite a few of them. I have one coming up, or two coming up that we'll talk about when we get into the news section, which I think without further ado, we probably can, yeah?
Let's do it.
Cool. I think you got a couple more than me, so why don't you go ahead and start?
All right, we'll start with the fun stuff. We'll go right in, and I don't know if anyone else had seen this article. It was big for a while.
If this is the one I think you're going to start with, disclaimer, we are talking about porn.
We are talking about porn, yes. It was the porn that ended up on a digital billboard in our grand state of Michigan. It was pretty awesome. I mean, of course they think it's funny. This thing happened. People were driving down the interstate, slowing, taking pictures. That makes it dangerous, but of course this is the whole hackers getting in debate. How did they do it? Well, you do a follow-up article, which we'll have the links later. We'll do a blog post later, put all these links in there. It was just a couple of guys that knew where the shack was that managed the billboard itself. Got in, uploaded this compilation of porn, and there was nothing there to stop them, right? They literally just walk up, open the door, plug in a USB, transfer the video file over, and hit play.
Dude, of all of the things, of all of the little breaches that you read about and stuff, that has got to be one of the funniest ones.
Absolutely.
Relatively harmless other than the distraction risk, but just hilarious.
Yeah, and apparently, you read through the news articles, some people were saying, it was lesbian scene, some was saying it was a blowjob scene, so it was definitely a compilation. And even a bunch of people said consistently that billboard showed just a Windows desktop background more consistently than it showed an ad. So,
and you did way more research into this than me. I was not aware of the specific types of porn.
Well, I read through the articles. I found it entertaining enough that I wanted to see what sort of technical information they were going to release about this, or if the news was going to get super sensational with it being hackers. And this was one of the ones that I was pretty impressed that they just got down and talked to just the facts of how the things happened.
Yeah, it's still hilarious. I just can't help it. It's just funny. It's one of those things. So and fun story, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more. When I was rolling out of consulting, the new hotness at the time was crypto miners, right? And I used to joke with some of the guys that, if you're going to have a breach, if you're going to have something like that, if you're going to have some outbreak of a problem, a crypto miner is really your best case scenario. Because the crypto miner, other than, upping your electricity bill, is relatively harmless. It's not an emotet. It's not ransomware. It's not locking shit out. It's a relatively harmless way to exploit you. That's your best case scenario breach situation.
Yeah.
And this is same thing. It's funny. Crypto miners are less funny, but it's your best case scenario breach situation.
Yeah, because they didn't exploit anything. They just removed the file from the computer. Things are ready to go back to normal.
Yeah, exactly. Absolute best case scenario situation. I can move into another kind of interesting one, and I'm not super read up on this because I just saw it about 5 minutes ago. But what about AWS Deep Racer?
What is that?
AWS Deep Racer is a machine learning car that's 1/18th scale race car, driven with reinforcement learning, a 3D racing simulator, and a racing league.
What?
It looks ridiculous. It really kind of does.
This sounds like we're going to have, what is it, Maximum Overdrive, that old horror Stephen King book where this alien ship was flying over and these vehicles were, why do I see that coming to play now?
Attack of the 1/18th scale cars. That would be fantastic. I would enjoy watching somebody being chased down the street by 50 1/18th scale little Amazon cars.
Except for what's going to happen. We know Amazon's going to aggregate all of the location data and sell it to advertisers so they know exactly who to send medical aid to at how much of a markup.
Yeah, and if, realistically, you block that kind of stuff from your network, it's just going to kill your battery.
Why do you say that?
Because I can tell you a story about my kid's tablet. I am a dad, by the way. So I have a little kid who has an Amazon Fire like kids tablet with the kids subscription thing. And I run Ubiquity Stack in my house, and I run a Pi-hole and all that stuff. So Pi-hole built in kind of blocks some of the Amazon tracking stuff. I started to notice that my kid, the battery on my kid's tablet was just dying real quick, and I'm start logging in and I start checking stuff, and I look at the Pi-hole and like it's blocking hundreds of thousands of connections to Amazon like every couple hours. And like, oh, apparently if you don't allow this shit through, it'll just keep trying. And there's something that concerns me about that level of tracking on a kid's tablet in and of itself. Like, it's one thing to track me or whatever, but like, you hear the story about like, you know, the 15-year-old at Target whose dad got mail about like having a baby, and that's how they found out she was having a kid, because Target knew. So like, tracking kids is frightening.
Super frightening.
That's a whole topic for another show, yeah, but super frightening. But I did think that thing was really interesting. I saw a picture of it, and it's just AWS AI, like machine learning race car.
I mean, as far as the concept goes, I love it, right? Like, put development in the home, let people learn, and, you know, with as a parent, being able to, like, guide your kids to that kind of stuff is fantastic. You know?
Yeah, except Amazon is basically the devil.
Except Amazon's basically the devil. So, concept is good, find a different implementation, and we probably have something fantastic going on here.
Yeah, there might be some really cool stuff that comes out of this. Like, I don't want to judge too hard on this. Like, Amazon does more than just track user data. Not much more, but they do a little bit more than that.
And we just like to make fun of them for it.
Also true. So what else you got going on?
I think we can put these next two together and kind of spawn out from either one. Because I was reading over stuff right now I work remotely, getting the training program going because I just came off a contract and we're still getting everything going. So the company that I work for is getting ready to lease some WeWork space for us. And so I wanted to do a little bit of research.
That sounds awful.
I'm not looking forward to it because, one, I fucking hate the open office format. The low walls, the loud noises, it's distracting as hell. So that was one of the things that I saw some news articles about and thought we could talk about, was this open office formatting and how it's actually counterproductive to productivity in the office space. Because what ends up happening is people like us now will put headphones on in order to block out the distractions, and it actually degrades from that collaboration because they're zoning themselves out from the people around them.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. And not entirely wrong. And like, it's the weird thing because there's pros and cons to both, right? Like, when I was doing technical work, I was full-time remote, and I really enjoyed it. Like, I kind of set my own schedule. I did the technical work when I wanted to, which was usually pretty late at night. I had a good time with it, but I did communicate pretty well with the other guys. Now, like, I go into the office, I get very little done, but that makes sense because I'm a manager. I get very little done in general. Like, most of my work is meetings, right?
Absolutely.
But I joke about that, but it is work. Like, I'm building a program. At the same time, like, if I really need to get something done, like if I have a presentation or something really important, like, I work from home because I'm way more distraction-free in the quiet, and even the headphones just don't work. But when you stick a bunch of people and a bunch of noise into one space and you have to wear headphones to drown it all out, yeah, I can see how that's a problem.
Yeah, and that's what this article was talking about, is that they, despite the pitch to make it more collaborative, is that it ends up being less collaborative and less productive because of the constant distractions in that place.
There's also another interesting concern with something like a WeWork, right? A WeWork is a shared workspace, so a bunch of people are there, and it's relatively open office in concept. Most of the time, the work that we do, customers that we work for, things of that nature, like, they're highly sensitive. So when you stick a bunch of InfoSec people around, like, we can't yell at each other across the room, or we can't, like, talk to each other here and there because, like, we might be giving up information.
Yeah, and for since I work for an MSSP, I have to be very careful of the data classification for each customer along the way because they may not classify the data in the same way, right? So that just makes it infinitely more complicated where, like you were saying, in my home, I have a cat, right? I'm not a dad. I have a cat. He's not going to go telling the world about whatever I talk about out loud or decide to bitch about when someone screws something up.
True. So, I mean, right, there's that risk there. There's that inherent risk of somebody else being around and being like, oh, that company works for that company. Like, I've done tabletop threat hunting and breach stuff, like, all super sensitive. Like, can't talk about the customer. Like, not something I would really want to discuss in an open office like WeWork kind of scenario with anybody.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we'll see what happens. But, I mean, we could expand on that topic later, too, because we could keep going into the full office environment and things like that.
That might be its own show topic.
Yeah, and so with this next news article, there seems to be an uptick in people talking about how everyone's aware that there is a cybersecurity skills shortage. Like, there's 0% unemployment. There's over 3 million unfilled jobs. But then the question is this a self-inflicted injury?
And why are they asking that question?
Maybe because a lot of it is.
Yeah, but how, right? Like,
Yeah.
How is this self-inflicted?
Well, if we take a look at a lot of the job requirements, they're looking for people in general with a very high threshold of experience and entrance for very low pay.
You know, I just saw one today. Somebody was tweeting about this. It was introductory red team position. One of the must-haves was 3 years of developing exploits. And I thought that was
What?
really... Yeah, right? So I left the same comment that I always leave. Ignore the job requirements. If you like the job, apply for it, because for the most part, managers aren't going to care. I have a theory that I never apply for a job that I'm qualified for in the first place. But I also understand that I'm probably a little bit rare in that kind of arrangement. A lot of people will look at something and be like, oh, I don't meet all these things, I can't apply.
Yeah, and I think that's what ends up happening too, right? Because most people, let's say fresh out of school, maybe have 1 or 2 certifications with like little to no personal background, like they haven't set up a lab for whatever reason. They look at this stuff and they're like, how can I even possibly get in? Maybe the best way to go is to get an entry-level IT help desk position and try to work my way up. Like, I don't know what goes on in these people's minds. But obviously there is not enough people applying for these jobs, or else we wouldn't have such a documented, projected shortage, right?
Sure. Although, counterpoint. And I just want to make a counterpoint as somebody who does hire people for a living at this point. A good majority of the people, especially a lot of the people that I work with who have experience, and one of the reasons why I tend to source at conferences, and I tend to source from other contacts, and I tend to source that way, is because I find that a lot of the people that I talk to end up being paint by numbers. And that seems to be pretty common, especially at least on the blue team side. I can follow a checklist, but I'm never thinking past what it is. And like, there's a very specific, and we talked about it when we were setting up this show, like, to do well as a blue teamer, you almost have to have the mindset of a detective.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I find is a bit of a struggle when I hire, and I go through like, okay, like, even the what you would call the simple stuff, like walk me through how you would investigate a phishing email. Like, something came in, it's potentially phishing, how would you look at it? What would you care about? What would those things tell you? And a lot of times I get like, oh, I'd look for a link in virus total, and I'm like, well, what does that tell you? What if it comes back clean? Oh, well, then it's probably okay. But is it? What if it's targeted?
Yeah.
Then it's not okay. Like, there's a lot of different pieces, and there's definitely some lack of critical thinking at the same time. As somebody who goes through this with hiring a lot, is a lot of people don't seem to be, when they get into their entry-level job, pending that they do, they don't actually seem to be taught a skill set that can carry on to slightly more difficult work, so to speak.
Yeah, I totally get it. Like, when I've done interviews too, when I was doing the lead analyst stuff, I saw that a lot, which, you know, could easily lead me onto my soapbox on critical thinking being taught in public schools and how people are being raised, but then I'd just be an old guy ranting, you kids get off my lawn, in that rant.
Yeah, and I don't want to generalize, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of incredibly intelligent people that exist in this industry. Hands down, a significant number of intelligent people, and a lot of people who think really well. But you get a little tainted. Like, I can usually tell in an interview within about 5 to 10 minutes if that's somebody that I'm even going to consider moving forward to a technical interview. And to be honest, the gross majority of them I don't. And it's not because of lack of technical skill. It's because of lack of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that lack of critical thinking means that I don't think they'll pick up that technical skill. So I tend to hire like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed college kids who are really interested and really want to know this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's definitely easier to teach the technical skills on the job than it is to teach that critical thinking.
You can't teach the mindset.
Yep.
Much harder.
Which is why one of the questions that I like to ask when I do interviews, that I think we discussed at DerbyCon when we brought up this podcast too, was asking the candidates, the potential candidates, what sort of board and card games they like to play. As that is an indicator, typically, of the mindset that they're in and the things that they find enjoyable and challenging.
We did talk about that a little bit. However, I'm sure we could go on this topic, but we should save this one for later, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll talk about some cool stuff. So one cool thing, and I saw this the other night, and I think it's really cool. I haven't completely figured out how I want to utilize it yet, but I have some ideas. There's this new project that somebody's working on, and God, I'm sorry, I've got to go find out who, because I will feel really, really crappy if I don't give that person a shout-out. Faith Sarin has made a Twitter scraper that's basically pulling Twitter looking for IOCs and then visualizing some of that data. So it'll give you IOC counts across MD5, SHA-1, SHA-256s, email addresses, IPs, domains, URLs. It'll give you daily entries and kind of the number. It'll break it into like a tree map, so it'll tell you like phishing related, fish kit, malware, emotet. It'll do it for like daily. It'll do it overall. It'll give you like the last couple entries. You can look at it as a table. You can also search it. So you can search this stuff from a historical perspective and look at all of it and then go look for the interest in Twitter. Or the actual tweet is linked into this thing too. This thing is really cool. Like I said, I haven't entirely determined the usefulness or how I want to use it, but as an investigation resource alone, I think it has some merit. So say I'm looking at something that's suspected phishing, or I'm looking at MD5 that I'm unsure of. I'm going to have like my paid threat intel sources, and I'm going to have all these other things that I can potentially go to. But now I also have this thing that I can go search across that covers the entire community, and see if anybody has talked about this or if anybody has had it. And that's not necessarily going to tell me good or bad, but it's going to give me some context if other people are seeing this problem, right? It's just super, super cool, and I'm really excited about it. And it has a dark mode. And
dark mode!
Yep. You can also change the sidebar colors, which is also super cool. Like I sent it to somebody that I worked with. He goes, so much magenta. I said, just change it to blue. I like the magenta personally. It's fabulous.
That's why it makes me think the person who built this built it on Cabanas. It looks a lot like a Cabanas thing, and it would make sense. But yeah, I agree. This thing looks fantastic. I'm looking forward to this weekend to being able to play around with it more, to see potential, and see if it's a resource that I can add to the analysts that I'm helping to mature now as another resource for them when they're doing either context or actual like low-level threat intelligence gathering.
Sure. The website is tweettioc.com, by the way. tweettioc.com. We will have a kind of blog post that goes along with this show that'll have some of the links to the things that we talked about, because I think that'll be pretty useful. So we'll kind of throw that up in there. But that way, for anybody who's just listening, if you're interested, timestamp this at about 2846, probably about 2840, and you can get that URL. Let's see. What else do we have? What else? I guess, so let's talk about conferences and stuff a little bit.
I was just going to say, like, where are you at? What have you been doing?
So I spent my day today at a conference called OSDFCon, which is the Open Source Digital Forensics Convention. A little bit different than your standard B-Sides or HackerCon, but it was still a lot of fun. And there were some really good talks. So there were 2 different talks on Linux forensics that I thought were really cool and kind of useful. There was a really good talk on some cloud investigation stuff, since we're moving that way. Basically, the track 1 was a whole bunch of technical stuff. They did some Volatility 3 stuff later in the day. But honestly, I think the best talk of the day came from an individual by the name of John Glass. I think it's GlassSec on Twitter. He did a CyberChef overview. For anybody who's not familiar with CyberChef, it's basically, God, how do I explain this? You give it an input, and then you can have it encode or decode in a whole bunch of different ways, and then it'll spit you an output. So he went through like the first thing. I've used it for, analyzing any VB script, any binary conversions, all kinds of different stuff, hex and base 64. I've used it a lot. But I realized today that I barely use this tool, because the one thing that I learned coming out of this is that you can drop a file into it, and then you can kind of parse out that file. So instead of having to like go parse out all the information from this file yourself or this Word doc, you can literally just drop the Word doc into it. I thought you had to give it code. No, you fuck it, just lay the Word doc over top of it. It'll take the Word doc, it'll spit out the stuff. You can regex to the code section that you want, and then you can start to decode everything. Super cool talk, man. And he was doing like some other cool forensic stuff, like some 24 or 25 step recipes that he was building with this thing. I would check him out on Twitter, because I think he's going to share the slides, and the slides have a lot of kind of that methodology, and you can get a lot from them. He's also going to add a repository, or at least a Twitter thread or a Git, where other people are sharing their CyberChef recipes so that you can take them and use them yourself.
Nice. I was just going to ask about that in his presentation, because I know some of the forensics people that I work with would be totally interested in seeing that output.
Yeah, as far as I know, that stuff should all be released. And he's gonna release it, or hopefully he'll link to where it does. I'm gonna keep an eye on it, and we can update. But man, such a cool talk, because it's a tool that I use all the time, and I had no idea that it could do way more than I thought it would. And that's just further proof that I don't do that much technical crap anymore.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, didn't he? You were telling me, didn't he do a recipe that was related to emotet and commodity malware?
So that was the base recipe. So like, the emotet thing that he kind of went over, I think, was like an 8-step recipe. So he dropped in the Word doc that came in the phishing email. He kind of regexed to the specific section of VB. Then he ran the like byte offset for it, or like the count offset, to get the full command, cleaned it all up, removed all the caret stuff. Like, it can do a lot of stuff. And he basically did this whole thing and basically took it from VB to IOC in 8 steps, which was super cool. But even more than that, like just taking it from VB to the actual PowerShell is also super cool. Yeah. It's nice to get the URLs, and he's talking about kind of being a nerd. So like, he'll pull down a new emotet sample from VirusTotal, he'll stick it into the same recipe, he'll grab the new URLs, and then he'll post the new URLs. He'll be like, hey, I'm just going to keep a steady stream of all these C2 URLs coming out. Like, if you see them, here you go, which was super, super cool.
Nice. So emotet is a banking Trojan that is a commodity malware. Now, would you mind telling us just what commodity malware is, that way in case we get any listeners that are
We're
new
not
to the
there
industry?
Yet. Okay, we can go there.
Yeah,
That's
we can go there.
We'll go there, and then I can talk about B-Sides DC as we close.
Yeah, I think we could put DC at the end.
It might be better to talk about kind of malware, not before we get into commodity malware. And I'm going to super simplify and possibly bastardize this whole topic. Malware, as we have termed, is essentially malicious code. So code that has a malicious purpose. This can be a whole lot of different things, and this can mean a whole lot of different things. But for the most part, when you're utilizing malware or any other attack, there's a couple things that you're after. Be that access, be that persistence, whatever, there's genuinely at the end of it 2 things that you care about. You care about money, or you care about data, which you then use to get money. Those tend to be, like, from a cybercrime perspective, the 2 things that you're after. Commodity malware is essentially referred to as a less specific form of malware. So it's not targeting the company that you work for, it's targeting everybody. It's targeting end users, it's targeting companies, it's targeting just about everybody. And when you see this kind of stuff come out, you'll see it in huge spurts. Drydex is an example. Emotet is a really good example today, because Emotet v5 is relatively new. I can talk a lot about Emotet v4 because I've done a whole bunch of breach cases on it. That's kind of the general basis of what we're looking at. So you're looking at banking Trojans, things that are trying to steal bank account information, things like that. Ransomware, things that are locking you out of your computer and making you pay a ransom.
And it's commodity because non-technical people, if they know how to get access to the right forums or the right people, can just pay them money and utilize a campaign and software malware that someone else writes in order to run these campaigns, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate. Although, I mean, the people who write Emotet, which is a form of commodity malware, and a relatively advanced form at that, like, they're actively exploiting it themselves. They're just kind of spraying it out wherever they can get it. Emotet is the new big one, right? Because Emotet is back. Like V5 is back.
Mm-hmm.
There's a brand new campaign. One of the interesting things about this is it tends to seem like it always kind of goes the same way. Like, how do you infect a person? If you were going to attack, how would you do it?
Phishing emails.
Yeah, phishing emails. So Red Canary put out a report relatively recently, this year, I think. It was this year, like their threat brief. And you go through this, and I think they left phishing out, but they were kind of going through like the MITRE stuff and like where they're seeing stuff. And number one was PowerShell after you leave out phishing. So you're seeing phishing and you're seeing PowerShell. And that's essentially what everybody is doing at this point, is phishing and PowerShell. Guess what? Emotet V5, phishing and PowerShell. Emotet V4, phishing and PowerShell. Drydex, phishing and PowerShell. I taught a introduction to malware analysis class at DEF CON with a Drydex sample, and it was phishing and PowerShell. That's just what you see.
That's our first challenge coin, right? Like when we produce our own challenge coin, it's going to be phishing on one side and PowerShell on the other.
That should just be the tagline for the show: phishing and PowerShell.
But yeah, so I mean, like phishing because it works and it bypasses most modern defenses. You get a user to click something, and we're now in the user execution aspect of the MITRE attack framework. And PowerShell because we're living off the land. And why is it? What would you say is the current logging state of PowerShell in companies in the private sector in general?
Genuinely pretty low, specifically because to get good PowerShell logging, you need more than one ID or EID.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, I can't remember them off the top of my head. It's like 400, 403, 500, 501. I don't remember. I swear I don't.
That's why.
But there's another one that's up in the thousands that's actually PowerShell content. So seeing a box run PowerShell, good to know, but not really that important. It's PowerShell content that you need.
Yep.
And PowerShell content isn't something that, last time I checked, was on by default. PowerShell content was something that you had to turn on. Now, that said, if you have some EDR technologies, the CrowdStrikes, the Carbon Blacks of the world, they're actually looking pretty closely in detecting things off PowerShell. So they do a pretty good job with that. But again, your small to medium-sized business likely can't afford really good EDR technology.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you can do is use sysmon to do actual pulling the content of the commands that are being passed through the PowerShell and sending it to the application logs in Windows events that way. But again, sysmon, and then you need some sort of like log aggregator tool query system like ElkStacks, Logarithm, Splunk, in order to be able to query that and be able to set relevant queries and logic to be able to make that useful.
Or full endpoint data, OS query, any of the Windows
Yeah.
event logs, a Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, whatever.
Yeah.
What gets really interesting about it, Emotet specifically, and again, I'm not super up to date on V5, but like I can talk a lot about V4 because I worked a lot of cases with V4. That initial binary, that initial thing that came through, that initial binary that downloaded wasn't inherently malicious. Like it wasn't detected by most AVs. I like to say modular because, and one of the things that scares people about Emotet is just this. Like it'll come in, it'll hit a system, it'll install, and then it'll call out and it'll go, hey, give me this. Hey, give me this. Hey, give me this. One thing is SMB spreader. One thing is other malware, Quackbot, TrickBot. All kinds of stuff. And as we talk about like a story, I can tell you that I went into a company where within 3 hours, Emotet had shut down and infected 60% of their hosts from SMB spreader. And they caught it because of all the account lockouts that were happening. They were smart. They pulled the network plug. Now, I realize that's not a realistic thing that people can do all the time, but that was a pretty rapid spread. Where another company I went into, same problem, same kind of thing, didn't pull the network plug. They had a whole bunch of rootkits that this first company didn't have. And like rootkits, you can't really clean with AV. Not really that easy.
Have they ever been? I mean, I remember back in the day when Rootkit Hunter was the big thing for that.
Sure. So essentially, we're seeing a resurgence in this stuff. So we're seeing a lot more of it, which in general, relatively scary. They make money off this stuff. You actually have some statistics from some of the crimeware, extortion, theft, ransomware stuff, right?
Yeah, I found some that was aggregated on March 24th of this year from Safe at Last, this is just some generic cybercrime stuff, which involves banking trojans, ransomware, and just kind of everything that's the cybercrime orientation. But cybercrime, from what they were able to find, generates 1.5 trillion US dollars per year. And that the average hack, I guess, through what they're saying, the average hack was every 39 seconds. It's probably just aggregated across the world for compromised systems from automated things like emotet and all the various ransomware campaigns.
Sure. Now, I also saw something about the average hack costing a company like $133,000.
Yeah, I think,
and that's not just in ransoms. That's in staff and downtime and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I think that was specifically just ransomware and not just cybercrime across the board.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I think what it brings it up is the majority of what we're seeing and what we've seen and see people talk about as far as what cybercrime is mainly from the motive or the tactics of extortion and outright theft, right? Banking trojans try to get your financial data or spoof financial information to just straight up steal money from your account, and ransomware is just a logical extortion tactic, right? I got your stuff.
Sure.
I'm holding it ransom. But yeah, so it was ransomware. The average ransomware attack was about $133,000 per ransomware incident. Now, an interesting statistic that I found from another article about the return on investment for a criminal running ransomware, their initial estimated average upfront cost was less than $1,100.
Okay.
So go ahead.
One of the other interesting things that I noticed when that was cited was that they don't really necessarily talk about what it costs to bring in like a IR consultant on top of that, which a lot of companies aren't really set to deal with that. And IR consulting is expensive. Worth it in most cases, especially if you're not built to deal with it, but expensive.
It is very expensive. There was a recent case with the city of Atlanta got hit, where if you go do the research, you can see they posted a bunch of numbers of what it cost them, and you can definitely get a spitball figure on how expensive that is.
Yeah. So on the specifics of emotet, and this is interesting, we talk about this term banking trojan, and ultimately banking trojan is not super sexy or super interesting. It's an installed application that tries to access your banking details. So it might be looking for specific banks, it might be looking for different things, it might be looking for what looks like credit card information. That's essentially what a banking trojan is. What makes emotet so scary is how much they're packaged with everything else. So emotet will pull down a whole bunch of much worse things, from ransomware, which can basically lock you out and kill all your files if you don't back up, to rootkits that can give somebody a backdoor into your system. Like, emotet as a base banking trojan is scary. It's also more advanced than most of them in a lot of ways. I made the comment once. I remember when I was working on one of these cases, on a sample of emotet, I was like, man, this is way too cool for a piece of commodity malware. Like, this is good work. Like, you hate to admit that, right? But it's good work.
Well, to me, every time I see it, I'm like, it means the criminals are using software development life cycles a lot better than the companies that I've worked at.
That's probably pretty accurate. But how do you stop it, right?
Yeah.
So, we know it comes in through phishing. So the first question that I would ask anybody out there is, what does your phishing program look like? How are you detecting some of this stuff? Like, are you relying on a tool like Proofpoint to tell you something? Are you pulling in logs of things and then kind of making some correlations and scrolling all of these things and looking for senders and subject lines and kind of looking at suspicious subject line pairs? Like, that's one place that you can start. And it's going to be a little bit, it's not going to be like a, oh my God, turn on the alarm kind of detection, because it's going to probably be a little bit noisy. So we might call it a hunt. And we'll probably do a whole talk on the definition of hunting, because I can soapbox about that for a while. But I have stopped being such a dinosaur, and I will say you could probably use that as like a hunt or a dashboard or something of that nature. But that's one place that you can kind of start. And if you can stop something before execution, it's better. What do you got, Exile?
Yeah, so first off, yes, please, let's do a topic on threat hunting, because another thing that I have to build in addition to a training program is an actual threat hunting program. So I will definitely be wanting to talk about that.
Oh, we're gonna have fun with that then too, because one of my topic for this talk at B-Sides DC that I'll talk about as we close is I'm hunting wabbits and why you shouldn't worry about a threat hunting program until you already have an established detection program.
Correct.
But anyway, we'll get to that
yes. Yeah, so you were saying the whole phishing program. Now, something we can get a little bit specific on that seems to be general behavior, right? So if we move up the pyramid of pain up towards those TTPs at the top, we want to look at behavior, right? So fancy graphic, but really what it comes down to is moving from atomic indicators like IP addresses, hashes, things like that, up towards ways we can detect the behavior of it itself, because the behavior is harder to spoof than atomic indicators.
By the way, there are a crazy amount of atomic indicators online. If you literally type in emotet 2019 or look at like hashtag emotet on Twitter, crazy amount of atomic indicators. And it changes all the time. Like, to go back to that story about that engagement that I worked, 60% of their network screwed, right? 175 different hashes. Because it's polymorphic and it changes every time it resets itself. So, I mean, we were playing whack-a-mole. Like, I was tossing some stuff over to their AV vendor before anybody else had detections for it, which was really cool. But at the same time, like, that's a crazy amount of whack-a-mole.
Yeah. I mean, from what I was seeing from some of the recent samples, like, they even got a little bit more sophisticated on the being polymorphic, where function names and even some of the random text in there is pseudo-randomly generated at execution time. So it'll look different every time that it runs on a different computer. But to get back what we were talking about, the behaviors, is a behavior with emotet specifically that hasn't changed is it's been malicious macros running inside of a Word document. So there's a behavior that we can work off of that, where if we look at the parent-child spawning process relationship.
That's very true. And realistically, that's a really solid detection, not just for emotet, but for all other kinds of stuff. So if you see Word, Excel, those Office products, then this is pending that you have the tooling to be able to match parent-to-child process.
Yes.
If you see, like, Word to Excel, and you see those things opening CMD, opening PowerShell, spawning any of these other processes, like, that's a pretty high level indicator that something screwy is going on.
Or you see MSHT or HTA files involved in any way from the internet, because a fun thing about HTA is it can run PowerShell commands without invoking PowerShell.
True that. And that's one of those things that I call, like, it won't necessarily always be bad. And we'll probably never say, like, 100% fidelity. But I don't really rank things like that. I rank things by intent, fidelity, and frequency. That's one of those things that's going to tell you, hey, I should probably look at this. And to me, that's a good detection.
Yeah, absolutely. Because very few instances outside of Excel documents in places that run with financial numbers do you have command prompts or PowerShell running from macros.
Right? One of the things that I did on said engagement that I've talked about earlier too, and I thought this was really interesting because, like I said, it's very polymorphic, and I didn't necessarily, like, we weren't implanted, so we didn't have the tooling so that we could see those parent-to-child process relationships. But what I did was I took a look at some of the ones that I knew were bad, some of the binaries that I found that I knew were bad, and they all had some similarities. In this case, I think they were all between like 65 and 74 kilobytes, and they were all unsigned. So I just did a pretty wide sweep of unsigned binaries between that file size. For V5, I'm not sure, but you could probably pull down a couple sample binaries to run, kind of find that out, and you could probably repeat that. And that's honestly how I found probably 70 to 80 new binaries in that situation.
That sounds awesome. That would definitely be something I'm looking into. Yeah.
It's very specific, though, because you have to kind of know what you're looking for already, but it was super cool. I liked that one. And then you had another one, right?
Yeah, I found this guy who was, let's see, I've got his Twitter post up here. It was Ecstatic Noble. He did an interesting thing. This is more along the lines of the atomic indicator, but it was an interesting way to go about it, so I wanted to bring it up. He posted this question where he was doing emotet research on his own, and he was looking at the set cookie response header, and he found looks like he reverse engineered like a regex match that was case insensitive, and he asked if there was a way to track and block emotet based on this in the set cookie response header.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting too, and we'll have that link in the update after this episode goes live, so you can go pull it up. He's got a ton of screenshots. He talks about correlating the unique, the IP and domain indicators that he found. But yeah, I thought it was very interesting, and would be an interesting way to go about detecting that stuff to see, what was the fidelity on that, what was the false negative ratio on using that as an atomic way to detect emotet.
Yeah, disclaimer, we haven't tested this.
Correct.
But you can, and then you can tell us how it went.
All right, so looks like we're closing up on time here, so this would be a good time to talk about B-Sides DC.
It is. So let me make sure that I get the dates right, because for anybody who's going to be at B-Sides DC, I will too. That's going to be the 26th and the 27th of this month, so in 2 weeks or so. I am going to be giving 2 talks in a row. Shoot me in the head now for that, please. So I'll be on stage for 2 hours. Hooray. The first one's a no record, though. So we're doing Tales from the Firewall, Blue Team Horror Stories. I have a wonderful panel that's going to be up there, a wonderful moderator. There will be ample shenanigans, I am sure. I'm aware of a couple of them. Some of them I'm being told from my moderator that they're going to be surprises. Those should be a lot of fun. And then I'm also giving another talk after that called What Did the Sim See? And it's going to be kind of talking about like general sim, how to get the most out of your sim, and then a little bit about what I like to call the hybrid alerting strategy and how to utilize all your tools in one place to make like things work well and how to structure that. I'm really excited for it. I like the B-Side shows a lot. I like talking at B-Sides a lot. So super duper excited. I think it's going to be a good time. This actually should end my speaking engagements this year.
Nice. I wish I was a little bit closer to DC, but that flight from Portland, Oregon to Washington, D.C. is a bit long, and I've got some Halloween parties to plan for.
You got to do some ShmooCon this year, man. I got like 5 or 6 things to submit. I'll get off my ass and do it eventually.
Yeah. Well, I need to get on my ass and start submitting stuff myself.
Yes, you should. For the most part, though, that has been the show. It'll probably be a relatively similar format to this. I don't think we've picked the next topic, but we are shooting for bi-weekly. In the future, we'll probably release them on Sundays. This one's going to be a little bit different because we don't actually have, we're not listed in Apple yet. We're not listed in any of those places. And I'm leaving for a wedding this weekend. So probably as soon as we finish recording this, I'm going to go through the process of trying to get us listed and getting everything up. But we'll be shooting for bi-weekly from there, probably with scheduled releases on Sundays, so that your Monday morning commute, should you want to listen to those 2 or 3 people, you can. Absolutely.
And we will always put up the follow-up from every episode on our website, which is detections.org. Pretty easy to get to. And this was Detections Podcast.
Yeah, I leave that part to Exiled because I suck at documentation.
I'm kind of a writer, so.
There you go. Take care, everybody. Go forth and find evil.
And be wonderful.
To each other.